Good evening. Okay. Of course, text, and words on the screen. We know what we're going to be looking forward to this evening. About the time that the conventional magazine was reborn as Interview or Rolling Stone, or even Wet, the magazine of gourmet bathing, another publication was beginning to attract a small but distinguished following. It has a classy Vignelli design format, which somehow perfectly navigated the turbulent waters between art and entertainment, while at the same time beguiling readers with a mix of highbrow theories and insider gossip. Half-tone dots parade across nearly every cover, showcasing faces, buildings, diagrams, words, with such vigor that classic issue of Ray Eames and Herbert Matter Design, Art and Architecture magazine immediately came to mind. Once inside the now familiar, but at that time, remarkable folio type format, one was introduced variously to Greg Lynn, Sarah Whiting, Stan Allen, the Ram, Bernard and Peter Shaw, and a collection of leading intellectuals and theorists, including Paul Virilio, Rosalind Krauss, and Colin Rowe, to name a few. It was, to all intent and purposes, the New York Times of the architecture world, and there has never been anything like it before or since. Its name, Annie, with multiple meanings and overtones, became just the tip of an iceberg that eventually encompasses the Annie conferences, the Annie Corporation, not the Annie Planet, but quite almost there, and became ubiquitous enough to actually deserve the title. It was like Henry Luce's famous Time, Life, Fortune trilogy, the icon for the serious discussion and dissemination of architectural theory. All things have that time. And when that time came for Annie, a few years back, its editor and creator, and Dora reminded me that I should say the driving force behind Annie, who is with us tonight, was already busy creating what in many ways was its polar opposite. Small enough to tuck into a purse or wedge in a jacket pocket, resolutely minimal in typographic expression, and parsimonious. I haven't counted. I was always tempted to, but I haven't counted. But I would be surprised if images count for more than 10% of the real estate. The new journal packs a dozen or more essays in about 3/8 of an inch. And it is called Log, one of the many synonyms of the word journal. No excuses, and never anything remotely approaching a friendly or comfortable presence. No. This log is for those who are looking for the needle in the haystack of not irrelevant consumer-driven drivel. It is for whom the discussion and its outcome is far more relevant than the physical product. Distilled, focused, and acutely tuned to, well, let's just say, rarefied concern of its audience. It is the Paris Review of Architecture publication, and we all love it. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to hear from the creator of these two seminal publications, and hopefully, through her eyes, to understand how to make sense of the developing amalgam of theory, practice, and personality that makes a life in architecture so challenging, exciting, and rewarding. Please welcome Cynthia Davidson.
Thank you. Now that Ming has laid out what I'm supposed to talk about, I have an idea of why I'm here. Editors don't speak a lot. Editors read, write, fact check, spell check, harass writers, but they don't talk a lot. So whenever I'm asked to talk, I really have to think, what is it that I have to say that isn't already said in the publications that I have done over 30 years now? Ming tells you a story about Annie and about Log, but I'm going to surprise her with a third magazine, which is in my mysterious past as well. I want to thank SCI-Arc for having me here. Since I didn't know what I was supposed to talk about, and Stephanie made me come up with a title for the poster, which is Image and Word, A Critical Context. I immediately decided I wasn't going to talk about that. And then when the email blast went out this week, which I received SCI-Arc emails, and I saw my picture and I saw the title of my talk, it said Image and Work. And I thought, that's great, because I never wanted to talk about Image and Word. And I do a lot of work. And an editor, of course, catches any kind of typographical error anywhere. So let's see if we can talk about context, but also talk about what context meant, still means, and how it's come to be meaning something other altogether before we go into the recontextualizing of architecture that I believe magazines do. So I've greeted you here with a blow-up of one of the pages of the Oxford Complete Dictionary that you have to read with a magnifying glass. But I was able to find literally an entire page in Oxford Dictionary on the etymology of the word context. I've always been very curious as to how architecture became something we talked about in terms of context, when in fact context has always meant writing. I will, not all of the page is here on the screen, but in 1432, context meant the weaving together of words and sentences, construction of speech, literary composition. By 1549, context meant the whole structure of a connected passage regarded in its bearing upon any of the parts which constitute it, the parts which immediately precede or follow any particular passage or text and determine its meaning. It begins to sound somewhat spatial when you're talking about passages and parts and preceding and following, but in fact it's still simply talking about text, the arrangement of words with text. But I did find in Oxford, and perhaps this is where the idea of context related to architecture began. I really don't know. I didn't spend a lot of time researching this. I didn't have the time to research it. Maybe somebody here has a better idea about this. But in 1853, in Stones of Venice, Ruskin writes, It is literally impossible, without consulting the context of the building, to say whether the cusps have been added for the sake of beauty or of strength. In fact, he's talking about the writing of the architecture itself, however, the cusps being beauty or strength within the object itself, not in relationship to a greater environment. So how do we get to this? This, if you Google the word context, is what you get. And the first definition today in 2013, context, which actually you can actually read this one, are the circumstances or setting for an event, statement, idea, terms which can be assessed, blah, 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 scene, situation, background, more the kind of way architecture or architects have been thinking about context. I know that in the 80s, when I first entered the architecture publishing scene, there was a great deal of talk about context. I don't know if this was a postmodern phenomenon, but when you look at the sort of usage, funny little bar at the bottom of the Google chart, there's a sudden rise in the use of the word context, starting in the 1950s. And if I had the time, this would be really something I'd want to think about and puzzle. Was this an expansion of the word context in other fields other than literature? Did new thinking in structuralism and post-structuralism eventually lead to its change? I don't know. Context is recorded in its original meaning as a text in multiple devices. This was a cartoon in the New York Times a while back that I particularly liked because it's really referring to how difficult it is to find things and to do research. You have to dig into the scroll, you have to page through the book, but if you have an e-reader, my gosh, there it is, just like that. But what I particularly like about this is that I don't produce any of these things, I produce magazines. So with that little prelude about context and the idea that magazines recontextualize through text an action of making that also relates to a different kind of idea of context today, I'm here to simply tell you a series of stories, because that's what magazine editors do. They craft stories, they select stories, they solicit stories, and that's what I am best at talking to you about today. This is a slide of the 29 issues of Log magazine, which was begun in September of 2003, which I will talk about later. But I'd never seen them together until about 4 weeks ago when we did a conference in New York City celebrating Log's 10th anniversary, and I asked my associates in the office, could just make something for people to look at when they come into the auditorium. And this is what they made. But before I talk about Log, I want to talk about the backstory, because the magazines that I've been involved in have a backstory, and it's the backstory that Ming is perhaps not aware of, or maybe it's a magazine we should all forget. I've done 3 magazines starting in January of 1983. Inland Architect, which was the magazine in Chicago. Any Magazine, which was part of the Any Project, which was launched in 1993. And Log Magazine, which was launched in 2003. Interestingly, each 10 years from the other. And in that sense, they each reflect, if you look at these images, if you look at the pages, if you look at the covers, if you look at the titles of some of the page articles you're going to see, you don't have to listen to me. You can read sort of the last 3 decades of architecture through these magazines. So I ended up in Chicago with husband number 1 in the fall of 1982. I'd been editing an art magazine, contemporary art magazine in Ohio, and I needed a job, and I found a magazine on a newsstand about architecture. I thought that looks kind of interesting, and I asked but it was the month of October, and it was the May issue, and I said to the news agent, I said, don't you have a newer issue than this? He says, no, they're always late. That issue just came. So I bought the issue, and I looked at it, and I thought, this looks really interesting. I'd been doing some historic preservation work in Cleveland, I liked architecture, maybe I could get a job here. So I wrote the editor, I said, I hear you always come out late, you need some help? He actually wrote back and said, I could use some help, but I can't hire you. Call the publisher. I wrote to the publisher called me, the publisher had me in for an interview, the publisher fired the editor and hired me. I didn't know anything about architecture, honestly. I knew who Frank Lloyd Wright was, Mies van der Rohe. I mean, I'd studied art history. You get a little bit of contemporary American architecture and art history, at least the classes I took. I didn't know a lot. But I was working for the architect, Harry Weiss, who was the publisher of Inland Architect. Inland Architect was a non-for-profit organization he had formed in order to keep this title alive. I immediately went into research mode. Inland Architect was founded in Chicago in 1883. I happened to arrive in 1983, 100th anniversary, first issue, 100th anniversary issue, even though it had only been published sporadically over those 100 years. So I went to the Newberry Library in Chicago, which if any of you are ever in Chicago, I highly recommend you do, because all of the copies of Inland Architect from the end of the 19th century are bound and in the Newberry Library. And I discovered that Sullivan and Root and Burnham and William LeBaron Jenney, they were all writing for Inland Architect. And Inland Architect represented the Chicago rebuilding of a destroyed city, and they were the guys fighting against the New Yorkers as to who was going to build the tallest, the fastest. So the first issue was basically a resurrection of articles that had been run 100 years before. The second issue, this is a photograph of Dan Kiley's garden for the Miller family in Columbus, Indiana, the Errol Saarinen house. And I only show it today because Dan Kiley always said, he's a landscape architect, lived in Vermont, a real eccentric, a fabulous human being, but he always said, step lightly on this earth. This was his motto. And some of the things I've chosen to show you today are things that I think are resonating still with issues that are on the table now for architecture, whether it's green or sustainable or material lightness. But Dan Kiley's step lightly on this earth always stayed with me. So we did landscape. We also did interviews. This was about the very brand new Department of Architecture and Design, the Art Institute of Chicago. It was only opened in 1982. Prior to that, really only the department at MoMA existed, and the kind of burgeoning of architectural departments and galleries in biennales that all of you who are students here today now probably take for granted. It didn't exist when I was doing Inland Architect. The first architecture biennale had just taken place in Italy 2 years before, and other departments of architecture would take place later on. Probably the most important debate that was going on in Chicago at this time was the struggle with postmodernism. Stanley Targerman, being a major figure in Chicago and a major proponent of postmodernism, was really up against the Skidmore, Owings and Merrills, the Helmut Jahns. Then Cohn Paterson Fox came to town and built this tower on the Chicago River. And no one could criticize the beautiful green reflective glass, which looks so modern, but there was a great deal of discussion about the base of the building and its striated granite, and a great deal of discussion about what this meant in the city of Mies. And of course, Mies, the ghost of Mies and the ghost of Wright in Chicago cast very dark shadows in the 80s still. I don't know what the shadows are today. But Mises' 100th birthday, had he been alive, occurred during this period. I can't tell the date, it's 86. So we did things like sexy centerfolds of the Farnsworth House, this famous Hedrick Blessing photograph. But then along comes 1988 and deconstruction arrives on the scene. This is a cover from Bernard Schumy's set of silk screens on the pavilions, the Follies he did for the Parc de la Villette in Paris. Inland Architect covered the Midwest in order to set it apart from the national magazines. I decided we're just going to cover the states that touch Illinois. Except I think we actually, maybe it was the Great Lakes. We went as far east as Ohio that doesn't touch Illinois. But there were certain things going on that we felt we also had to talk about. Katherine Ingram was in Chicago with me at that time. She wrote for Inland Architect a lot. That's where she started writing about architecture. This is her review, Milking Deconstruction, or Cow was the show. There were a lot of, the secret for me of making the magazine a success, well, Katherine herself was not an architect, was inviting architects into the magazine itself and making it a platform for architects to exchange ideas. And we ran at least 3 articles on the deconstruction show. Inland Architect changed design. Inland Architect, this is the last issue I did with this Kilgorski hand rendering. And then everything changed. I went to New York, and the Anyone Project was born as a think tank at which architecture would host a series of conversations, a finite number of conversations, throughout the decade of the 90s, all based on the compound any words in English language dictionary. And the first one was anyone. The project was the brainchild of Peter Eisenman, who became my second husband, Arata Izuzaki in Tokyo, and the late Ignazi de Sola Morales, who was a critic and architect in Barcelona. The idea was that architecture would act as the host for a range of cultural conversations in which they brought in philosophers, artists, writers, critics, lawyers, architects, and so forth. The first conference, in fact, was at the Getty when the architecture section was under the directorship of Kurt Forster. And every conference was documented in a book that was published containing all the papers and the proceedings, and you can see the names of the people who participated in the first conference here. The conference was happening once a year. That clearly wasn't often enough to sustain interest in this project. And so 2 years into it, we decided there really needed to be another magazine that broadened the conversation. The conferences, for economic reasons, were limited to about 25 participants. And the way to expand the participants and invite younger voices, new voices into the conversation was to start a new magazine. This led to the tabloid-sized magazine Any, which also stood for Architecture New York, and that was conceived as an activating magazine rather than a magazine that reacted. Inland Architect was a magazine that was reacting to what was happening. No matter who was writing, whether it was architects or critics, they were reacting to things that were already taking place in the Midwest. Any magazine said, we're not going to react, we're going to activate. We set out immediately to have small conferences in New York City that would bring people together, which would then become content in the magazine. We did a number 0. This is number 1, which was a conversation on the problem of seaside and the architecture of new urbanism, interestingly called American Urbanism by Andreas Dwani when this first took place. All of these issues I did with guest editors so that they would bring in a certain group of thinkers who could talk about issues that were then shared with an audience of about 200 people. What I like about this particular layout is that Andreas Dwani asked to see all the participants' submissions afterwards so that he could correct them. So the red ink are Andreas Dwani's corrections of Mark Linder's take on Seaside. These are the kinds of exchanges we were trying to engage. With Mark Taylor, the philosopher of religion, again, bringing in people from outside the discipline because architecture was resonating with certain kinds of ideas, perhaps coming out of post-structuralism, perhaps coming out of deconstruction, the deconstructivist show, perhaps for any number of reasons. Architecture was being thought differently than it is today. And it attracted people like Mark Taylor, who had a lot of things to say about what was happening in architecture. His idea was to do an issue on electrotecture. Now, probably half of you in the room were barely born in 1993, or more than half of you were barely born in 1993. Electrotecture was Mark's take on how the internet was going to change how we think about architecture, how we inhabit architecture today. And we had a panel of people who were talking about things like the well and community chat rooms. This is an Avital Ronell layout, who's famous for her book on the telephone. And in the same issue, an article about how a Japanese and a New York office were managing to do a project together because we now had the technology of the fax machine. And of course, I don't know if anybody even still uses a fax machine, and yet this was not that so long ago. So we were pretty cutting edge for the time. John Reichman, the philosopher, lining up again the kinds of, some of the names that Ming just read to you. This was an issue on the concept of lightness in architecture, and John's own piece on Korb's Phillips Pavilion. I show you these layouts in part because the image of any itself was a contextual problem. The designer of any, this is an issue on Colin Rowe. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The designer of any magazine was Massimo Vignelli. Massimo Vignelli had been the designer of all of the publications at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, which Peter Eisenman had founded in 1967. So Skyline, Oppositions books. And he had given a real graphic identity to this series of publications. When we wanted to do the Anyone project, we really didn't have enough money to hire a graphic designer, and Massimo stepped forward and said, I'll do it. I'll just give you a template. I'll give you a couple of my favorite fonts. He only works in 4 fonts. These are E-Century Expanded, and I forget the other one. And we said, sure. I didn't think about it. But as Any magazine began to roll, and as it began to pick up steam, and as the sort of theoretical underpinning of it became so increasingly apparently different from the things that had been produced by the Institute, I was getting a lot of comment from colleagues that we really needed to change the image of the magazine. We needed to recontextualize it to make sure it wasn't misunderstood as a project of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which had closed in 1983. So I show you these 2 pages. This was Massimo Vignelli's table of contents and Massimo Vignelli's design for my column, which I wrote at the front of every issue, which was called Dear Reader. It's legible, it's red and black, Massimo sort of warm red, I should say, his sort of classic colors. I consulted actually with a Californian, with Sheila de Bretteville, and said, Sheila, what should I do? And she said, well, I do urban scale stuff now. I don't want to do a magazine, but she gave me the names of 3 young graphic designers. And one of them was Michael Rock, and who was teaching at Yale with her. So I interviewed Michael Rock and Susan Sellers, and I liked them so much, I hired them right away. And this is the difference between their sensibility and Vignelli's sensibility. It completely changed the look of the magazine. Its content, I believe, had a certain energy before, but the graphic identity that Rock and Sellers gave us, Rock and Sellers became 2x4, and after this particular issue, which is the issue on Rem Koolhaas that we did as the kind of fake catalog for the OMA show at the Museum of Modern Art, this issue not only changed it changed Michael and Susan's life too, because this is how Rem found out who they were. They had a very different idea about publishing a 2-color magazine, which was that every 16 pages you're putting on a new signature, you change the colors again. So the issues became 8-color magazines. And they would time the signature breaks so that you would get juxtapositions like these. We also then opened ourselves up to certain criticism of legibility. You had to work now to read this magazine. You had to turn it. You had to wrestle with it, shall we say. This is perhaps my favorite graphic issue that I did with 2x4. But it also happens to be an issue that was edited by Wes Jones, who wanted to respond to Mark Taylor's electrotexture issue, saying the conversation about mech and texture wasn't over yet. And we did the second color in copper because copper is the color that's inside. Copper is the metal inside of wire. One of the obligations I imposed on Michael and Susan was that they had to keep Massimo Vignelli's logo when they redesigned the magazine so that people would at least remember what magazine they were looking at. But they were always playing with it, as you can see in this issue we did on the dimensions of play, where you couldn't even see the word anymore, which really irritated me. I felt I needed a brand. We then did an issue that's, I'm not showing here, number 90 for Philip Johnson's 90th birthday, and they came up with a completely new logo, which is the giant red one you see on the right. We then did an issue on memory, and I said, hey, where's my old logo? And they said, oh, well, here it is. And that's it. That's the end of the logo. In a certain sense, without every issue of any was thematic, with 6 or 8 people addressing a certain theme. Here, play. Frank Gehry is in this issue. There, memory, which was done by a philosopher of law at NYU. It made it very difficult to break the issues apart. Each was an entity unto itself, almost as if they weren't really speaking to each other in a funny way. But in a certain sense, too, we were also responding to things that were going on. The issue on public fear is an issue that Tony Vidler and I did together after the first terrorist bombing at Oklahoma City, and how people were reacting to that, which also, again, is, I think, a subject that's not been exhausted when we think about terrorism in our lives today. But then we also had issues as pragmatic, one could say, as looking at the diagram issue, which was guest edited by Ben Van Berkel and Caroline Boss, invited a number of people, you can see their names on the cover, to talk about the diagram in architecture today, its importance, how it's changed, how it evolves. This is from the public fear issue. Any being a 10-year finite project meant that any magazine really had to be a finite project as well. It was and it is extremely difficult to support theoretical work in the United States. The entire Anyone project was underwritten by Shimizu Corporation in Japan, who made $1 million pledge, paid out over 10 years, because they believed in talking and in thinking. And it's culturally, I think, been proven over time that the Japanese support this. The United States, I couldn't raise any money at all to keep this project going. I did get some money from Korea, I got some money from Germany, but it was extremely difficult. The only sort of theory that Americans want to talk about is the theory of pragmatism. This is extremely frustrating when you're trying to introduce other ways to crack nuts, shall we say, other ways to think about how to solve a problem, other ways to open up architectural thinking and architectural production. So the Any project came to an end in 2000, and so Any magazine came to an end as well. There were a lot of people who wanted it to continue, but I was exhausted personally and professionally, and I said, no, I gotta quit. I can't do any more magazines, it's too hard. So the last issue was number 27, it's called Being in Nothingness. And early on, in the middle of about the course of Any magazine, Michael Rock had said, because Deleuze was really hot, and the fold was really hot, and the rhizome and so forth, and he said, let's just do an issue that's just all about, it's just folded, let's just fold it. And I said, no, Michael, it's too literal. But I went back to Michael at the end and I said, let's just fold it. I don't want to trim and bind. I want its appearance in the mail to be mysterious. Is it unfinished? Is it falling apart? When people got the magazine, they didn't know what to do. And the great irony of this image is, when I asked an intern several years ago in my office to put some images together, he cropped the image, he himself, and the printer hadn't cropped the paper, but the intern cropped the image. He thought I didn't want the rough edges. What it meant when we only folded the issue and didn't trim and bind it is that every essay in the issue was a poster. So it was folded together like this, sometimes upside down, sometimes right side up, depending on the signature. But the article itself was poster size. So again, you had to struggle to read it, or you could wallpaper your room with it. You see, I really should just have you read this so I don't have to talk at all. This was my last Dear Reader column saying, bye-bye. This theoretical project is finished. Now, ironically, right before I came out here, last week, another one of these sort of email blasts that just, I hardly even look at them anymore because they come in so frequently, and all they do is sort of replay the same information over and over again, just moving stories in the order to make you think you're seeing something totally new. I get an Architect magazine daily email, and it says, the silly and the profound, theory is dead, read more. I thought, oh, I probably have to read that. So I clicked on it. I opened it up and I started reading it. And I said, oh my God. Any editor, Cynthia Davidson, her husband, Peter Eisenman, who claimed theory is dead. I said, oh, great, this doesn't work out too well. So Peter may have said that. I really don't recall. He certainly doesn't believe it, and neither do I. I may yet write a reply to Architect Magazine about theory being dead, although it is true, as he says later, or at least I'm led to believe it's true. The students here can tell me if it's true or not. He said, in place of any magazines, students now carry around Design Like You Give a Damn by Kate Storr and Cameron Sinclair. Greenbuild TED Talks and Clinton Global Initiative conferences are hot tickets. Well, yeah, they are hot tickets. Yeah, you can't carry any magazine around, any what you call defunct. Yeah, you get angry sometimes at the way you get sort of set up as sort of the poster girl or the poster boy for theory, and somebody has to keep it alive. So much for theory. I didn't do a magazine for 2 years. And then the World Trade Center went down. And then the World Trade Center design competition took place, and these were the 2 finalists. And I apologize, sort of, if these images are fuzzy, but I was kind of glad when I looked at the PowerPoint and thought, these are gonna really not look very good. Because of course, everyone was totally seduced by these images, and the only thing they were concerned about was the image of a new structure on the skyline of New York to take the place of the lost World Trade Center towers. So Daniel Libeskind on the left, Raphael Vignelli on the right. In all fairness, I should say that I was also part of a team that did an entry for the World Trade Center competition. I had never participated on an architectural competition before on the architect's side, and I really loved our project. But what concerned me wasn't that we weren't finalists or that we weren't winners. What concerned me was that nobody was talking about the issues and the architectural issues of the project or the urban issues of the project. Nobody was talking about the ground plane. They were only talking about the image. So I said, well, I have to start a new magazine. And so the new magazine is called Log. And Log has yet a different mandate from the magazine that reacted, a different mandate from the magazine that activated. This is a magazine that watches. This is a magazine that's observing a profession, a discipline, I should say. So I think of it as a discipline, not as simply as a profession. It seems to be a little bit, to me, lost at sea. Hence it's called Log, like a ship's log, like a captain's log, in which the captain would write observations. We saw an island, we saw dolphins on the bow, land ho, whatever. In other words, I'm not taking a position other than the fact that Log is going to resist the seductive power of the image that dominates media today, whether it's print media, television, or the internet. Hence, you can see the 2 covers here. Now I get to do my demonstration. The conceit of the cover design, the design is by Michael Beruit from Pentagram. And I knew that I couldn't totally capitulate to my idea that you can't have an image, but the postcards were the first great universal circulator of images in modern society, and therefore we could have postcards on the cover, but when you open the cover, the image would fall away and you would only have a cover story. I also was under the fantasy that people would send me these postcards with comments about the issues, and no one ever has. That's not true? One of my sons did once because he heard his mother complaining about it for so often. He sent me a postcard from my own magazine. This was the first issue, obviously, and no, that is not a photoshopped image. I don't know if you can read the cover story, but that was the contractor's house when they redid the parliament in Vienna. Log is not thematic, because how can I decide what the themes are that we need to be observing? We're not activating. I'm not saying we're going to do this. Log tries to be open. Log tries to see what's going on, who's thinking about what. It's a bit uncanny, however, that if I look at the 29 issues that I showed at the beginning, that when we have open submissions, and we only do 3 issues a year, there's always something in the air. The way that we don't consciously set out to say, well, we're going to look for articles this time on France, on French theory, or we're going to look at Pacific Standard Time in Los Angeles, whatever. We don't set out with that kind of goal, but it's uncanny how little nuclei form in every issue around which 2, 3, or even 4 people are thinking in about the same thing. Not in the same way, but about the same thing. Robert Somel and Sarah Whiting were 2 of the original protagonists, which is the name I gave sort of contributing editors, or an editorial board for Log. They offered to guest edit an issue. They did issue number 5. They immediately dropped the postcard. They were immediately put color on the cover. They were fighting me all the way. And in fact, this is their sort of really serious attempt to discuss the idea of the projective in architecture. And I wrote an editorial here saying, Bob and Sarah are great, but I don't agree with anything they did in this issue. And Bob Somel quit. And Sarah Whiting didn't speak to me for 6 months. But a lot of other people told me I had done exactly the right thing. So that even though I gave over the issue to other people that I really respect and admire, I felt we should be able to have differences. We should be able to talk about that. Log 17, which is, again, did away with the postcard, was jointly edited by Florencia Pita and Mark Gage. I think there's probably a lot of SCI-Arc associated people in that issue. Neither one of them changed the name Observations on Architecture in the Contemporary City, so I wouldn't really consider them thematic, but they were guest edited. The first 10 issues of Log were white. I got bored with that. I decided number 11 should be black. Our first postcard contest elicited this satellite dish from Algiers. This is the sort of dumbness of the magazine. There's no graphic design. It's just hang everything from the top. That's actually a pretty big picture for Log. This is a issue guest edited by Michael Meredith on the idea of the absurd. So he did do a theme. Instead of a postcard, he gave readers a 20-minute movie on a DVD. And then we have Log 29. Now, Log 29 is called In Pursuit of Architecture, and I decided to do something really different with this. I decided to turn the tables on our readers and solicited work from architects that have been built over the last 10 years in order to have a conversation in New York about where architecture is today. So I invited 10 architects and 4 critics to the Museum of Modern Art to do this. And I don't know if you probably can't see this back there because I don't have a slide of this. The average issue of Log is like a book. It has about 65,000 words in it. And Log 29 has about 15,000 words in it because there's 112 pages of just pictures. And I wanted to surprise our readers and say, okay, you want pictures? Here they are. See what you think. But when I brought the 10 architects and the 4 critics to MoMA on September 21st to celebrate Log's 10th anniversary, I was actually stunned because the 10 architects, each of whom gave a 15-minute presentation on the building that we had selected for the magazine. They were terrific. The images were interesting. The images were good. There was something to look at. They had something to say. The 4 critics didn't know what to do. They were squirming in their seats. And I know Joe Day was there, and I'd love to talk to Joe about what he thinks of what happened that day. But it was a really interesting confrontation. And either I chose the wrong critics, or I didn't give the critics enough of a platform to say what their positions were, so that we couldn't have enough of a debate, although the 4 critics write in here what their positions are. It was a very tense moment with people squirming, and at the end of the day, people yelling in the audience and on the stage. I went home with a fever. People say it was psychosomatic, but I thought it was really sick. It suggested to me that we really are at a moment where something has to change. That building beautiful buildings, which I'm really interested in, is one thing. But if those buildings convey enough for the critics to sink their teeth into, to be interested in, to be able to take a position on, is something other. And these critics found themselves talking about, well, why did you present like that? And I felt like I was in school in a jury where you might ask somebody, why did you present that drawing? Or why did you choose that way to talk about your project? Rather than looking at the work itself and addressing it. And whether it's because there's not enough theory in the work, there are clearly architects there who are theoretical thinkers, and there were architects there who are not, who are, you could say, phenomenologists and don't even realize it, who are interested in the craft of building. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't get people outside of architecture excited about architecture, from my point of view. So I'm going to end with something completely other. This is a William Kentridge drawing, which I really like. It's a series of drawings, but it's called Secondhand Reading, and it takes us back to the dictionary again. But it opens up the dictionary in a completely other way, where it becomes totally spatial, where the context of the words, the weaving of the words that constitute the dictionary becomes something other altogether. And I like the spatiality of the page that Kentridge makes very clear here. And I like to think that the magazines I have done are not just two-dimensional objects. They are spatial. And they provide a place, a literal, physical platform in which to have a discussion, in which to talk about issues that bear on architecture, whether it was in the 80s or the 90s or today. We're now embarking on log number 30. But I have to tell you, I don't know how much longer we're going to do this. Maybe a year, maybe 2, but something's got to change. And maybe some of you in this room are precisely the people who will be able to make that change for us. Thank you very much.